I'm going to do the whole video like this. I'm just going to be on the floor. Hello there. There's nothing strange about what you're seeing right now. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. In this video, we're going to be looking at the J. Smith and Ibrahim debate. What is this debate? I hear you ask. This debate is on the motherlode of all questions pertaining to Islamic history, Islamic studies. Did Muhammad exist? Did Muhammad exist? When we talk about Muhammad, is he a real person or is he just a figment of our own collective imaginations? And I wanted to cover this debate because everyone kept asking that I cover this debate. And thank you, friends, for doing that. Lazy, good for nothing. Why don't they cover the debate if they're so interested in it? No, but seriously though, thank you for everyone who wanted me to cover this, because I do think it is important, and obviously I have a stake in this. So I want to break it down what this is actually about, because I think this is misrepresented and very easily confusing. So let's start kind of at the beginning. J. Smith is representing the position that Muhammad did not exist. Ibrahim is representing the position that Muhammad did exist. But here's where we need to break this down. Neither of them think that the Muhammad of Islam, of Sunni or Shia Islam, is that same Muhammad. Neither of them are going to tell you that the Islamic sources have accurately preserved the core elements of Muhammad in all ways, in every sense, perfectly fine, and in a trustworthy, reliable sense. And for most people, that's sufficient. That is sufficient. And for most people, you don't need to go any further than that. No one is going to be arguing here from an academic perspective that the Sunni Shia traditions on Muhammad are reliable, true, and correct. You're just not going to find that, because that's not what academia says generally. They will have great amount of skepticism and superstition, great amount of skepticism and reluctance to accept the standard Islamic narrative, as J. Smith calls it, because we know there are a ton of problems with it. We find Christian stories in the Hadith that are obviously from the Bible. That means at some point, some sneaky Christians managed to convince a big group of Muslims in some of the most trusted Hadith sources, Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan al-Nasai, Sunan Abu Dawud, so on and so on, that these Bible stories are supposedly original things that Muhammad said. Christians actually convinced Muslims that this happened. Or at least Muslims overheard these Christians saying it and thought Muhammad said it. Either way, we know that's not true. We know it didn't originate with Muhammad. He's obviously referring to a Bible story. Usually it's quoting Jesus, but it just has Muhammad saying it, which is awkward and kind of plagiarizing. We know that the Hadith material has political elements that are contemporary at the time of when it was written or when it was mass transmitted, because it was very relevant to the time and day the particular caliphs and caliphates were living in. We also know it's hagiographic material. It is material that honors Muhammad and elevates him to a very high level. The Quran says Muhammad didn't do miracles. It's pretty clear about that, but the Hadith says he did do miracles, and they're suspiciously like the miracles Jesus did. Feeding lots of people, having water gushing from his fingertips. It kind of sounds like you were inspired by Jesus beforehand. And given that a bunch of Christians convinced a lot of the Hadith chain, the people in the Hadith chains, that these Christian Bible stories were actually said by Muhammad, it wouldn't surprise me if they also convinced people that Muhammad did these miracles that were very much suspiciously like what Jesus did. And both J. Smith and Ibrahim are going to be very skeptical towards that, and they're not just going to accept it. For most people, and I really want to get down to this, at the very core level, that is sufficient, because we have just demonstrated that Islam as a religion, by the two main denominations, is false. The same criticism applies for the Sunnis as well as the Shias and their narrations. We can, in effect, demonstrate that that is not the truth. There are things that are missing. There are historical facts that aren't being addressed in the traditions, so it's false. And you can just end the video at this point. But this is kind of what happens when you go after this and you start to deal with what's, in my opinion, basically just a different usage of the same terms. So I might tell you, let's play a little game to illustrate what I think the root of this problem kind of is. If I said to you, Chris has blonde hair, you'd say, okay, cool, Chris has blonde hair. I can see you've got blonde hair. It's definitely not ginger, by the way, regardless of what some people might tell you. Now, if I were to one day change my hair color to something other than blonde or ginger, most people would say, okay, that's fine. Chris is still Chris. It's just that he has a different hair color now. Fine. Now imagine if I told you my name isn't Chris, something else. Okay. Now for some people, that's sufficient to say that Chris isn't Chris anymore, because actually he has a different identifier, his name, and a name for a lot of people is such a personal signifier of who you are, as a signifier of identity, that if you change it, you're no longer that same person. And this is why I think you tend to find in like works. You hear of people who change their name, and it signifies a new change of person, a new change of personality, because it's quite substantial, and it's also very symbolic. But for other people that are like, no, just because you change your name doesn't mean you're actually a different person. You're still the same person, you just go by a different name. It doesn't really mean much. Again, two different groups. Now, if I said Chris actually isn't however old I am, he's a different age. Let's say I told you I was actually 21. Now, I'm not 21, by the way. But if I told you this, or it was found out that I was 21, would this change who I actually am in your mind? For a lot of people, the answer is yes, because a lot of my life experiences would not be the case if I was only 21 years old, and a lot of the things that I had experienced simply wouldn't be either seen in the same way, because I'm a lot older when I experience these things, or they simply wouldn't have happened because I'm not actually old enough to have done all these things. So that fundamentally changes my experience, which in turn changes who I am. Other people would say, no, age is just a number, it doesn't really matter. And I think you can argue from either side. Both of these perspectives are perfectly fine. At what point does someone stop being who they are? It's a deep philosophical question, and I think we're actually approaching this kind of level of depth when we talk about whether Muhammad, as a person, as a real historical figure, did he exist? So let's go through some things that we can say with a good degree of probability about Muhammad, the historical Muhammad. First point, he probably didn't die when the traditions said he died. Now, I don't think that would be a massive thing in and of itself. It would be quite a minor detail. The issue, though, is that it has implications for the other historical characters that come after Muhammad. For example, there is a line of succession. You have the four caliphs, the four rightly guided caliphs. Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali. Well, if Muhammad didn't die when we thought he died, that means that those guys didn't become caliph when we thought they became caliph, which in turn changes the entire historicity of what they did, or when they could have done it, quite substantially. If you knock Muhammad back, you have to knock Abu Bakr back, and Umar, and Uthman, and so on, or you just have to cut short some of their reigns. Either way, it does have quite a significant impact for what we think we can know about these characters. And based off recent scholarship, I say recent, like the last few decades or so, we have good reason to think that Muhammad didn't die in 632. He probably died a little bit later, and some people would even say he actually participated in the battles to conquer Syria, and that he probably died then. Why? Because our historical sources mention this. And these historical sources aren't from Muslims. They're from other people, mostly Christians, who were observing this and talking about how someone called Muhammad was leading an army, and therefore it seems likely that Muhammad was still alive at this point. Point number two, Muhammad wasn't born in 570. The reason for this is very simple. Muhammad supposedly was born in a particular day in a particular month in 570 AD. The issue with this is we know that that date doesn't occur in 570, it occurs in 571. So again, so it looks as if you can't trust a specific year. They may have been out by 1 year. They might say, oh, that's not massive. Fair enough, maybe it's not. The issue though is that the traditional narratives say that Muhammad was born in 570, the year of the elephant, and they tie it up with a particular event that occurs where some elephants, and again, this is very difficult to establish from historical perspectives. People would doubt why elephants would still be used at this point in history, because it seems as if they weren't. But anyway, elephants were coming from Yemen. They were coming from Ibrahim, who was the king of the Yemenite region at this point. He wants to conquer Mecca for reasons, like he's jealous or something. It's very strange. But anyway, he wants to destroy Mecca, the pagan site, because it was a pagan site at this point. So he sends elephants and other soldiers to go stomp on Mecca. But they get there and the elephants prostrate because they're good Muslim elephants, alhamdulillah, and then they go back and it doesn't happen, and they technically get pelted by birds that drop stones, which is another thing, and the Quran mentions this, or at least technically it mentions this. It doesn't tell you this is exactly the context, but you have to infer it. But anyway, yeah, it's there, sort of. The issue, of course, though, is that historians are really going to struggle to get that to meet 570 or 571. It looks like it happened a lot earlier, and that's just for his particular reign and for the times he went on expeditions in the context of war. It looks like it happened earlier than this, not anywhere near 570. We're talking a difference of decades, which again means that Muhammad really wasn't born in that tradition. That's pretty heavy because the Islamic narrative ties Muhammad's birth particularly with the year of the elephant and this particular event, when in reality they were actually quite far separated. Point number three, Muhammad probably wasn't an Ummi. He wasn't someone who was unlettered and didn't know how to read or write. That's probably just a later theological invention from the standard Islamic narrative. The reason we know this is because you can look at the Quran, and scholars like Nikolai Sinai, Gabriel Reynolds, Sean W. Anthony, and others would tell you it looks like a more reasonable and more likely explanation for the term Ummi in the context of the Quran is someone who is either a Gentile or someone who is not aware of the previous scriptures. They don't have knowledge of the previous scriptures. They aren't scribes or experts in the Torah or the Injil, for example. This better fits the verses where the Arabic term Ummi is found, which again, given that the standard Islamic narrative elevates this to the point where it says Muhammad did a miracle by simply revealing the Quran, because how could he have revealed the Quran with all these stories in it that have continuity with the previous scriptures if he was illiterate, which again is a really bad argument if you think about it. Even that seems to be a later theological development that is just reread into the Quran and reread into the person of Muhammad, because Muhammad, he could have been illiterate, but it certainly wasn't because of what the standard Islamic narrative says. Point number 4, there are serious concerns about Muhammad's life and what he was doing in the Hijaz, given that the Hijaz doesn't seem to have contained a major pagan site of worship and pilgrimage at the time, and trade, supposedly, at the time of Muhammad. Dr. Ahmad al-Jalad and others have been looking at the inscriptions near the Hijazi region, particularly in places like Taif and others. And the inscriptions they find there, when they date them, it looks as if there was polytheistic beliefs around 300 AD and prior. But after this, when you get into the 4th, 5th, 6th century, maybe particularly the 5th and 6th century, you stop seeing these polytheistic inscriptions on stones and on rocks. Instead, you see monotheistic ones. What does that mean? It means that Muhammad wasn't born into a pagan world. He was born most likely into a monotheistic world, which would then cast doubt on the existence of Mecca as a major pilgrimage site for polytheists if we have no inscriptions from polytheists for the few hundred years leading up to Muhammad's time. Now, was Muhammad even born in Mecca? That, I think, is kind of the wrong question, because maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. Mecca is an incredibly insignificant area at this point, to say the least. The real question is, did everything that supposedly happened regarding Mecca actually happen, according to the standard Islamic narrative? And I think most people will probably err on saying no. Mecca doesn't seem to have the infrastructure, the capacity, the vegetation, the historicity, the notoriety, the significance to cover the religiosity, actually, is another point. It just doesn't have these things. You would have to believe that the Quran was revealed to someone who went around telling people about boats and sailing in the ocean, most people have probably never even been there. If you wanted to go to the Red Sea from Mecca, you've got to travel quite a number of kilometers to even get there. And most people probably wouldn't have, unless they had a very good reason to. But given there wasn't like a local fishing area there, as far as we can tell, it seems like most people wouldn't have had access to that. And exactly who are we talking about here? We're talking about incredibly small groups of people. Even in Islamic sources, actually, you can redact some early Islamic sources that did census work on Mecca, and you're going to get a very small community. I'm talking in 3 digits. That's 3, maybe 4 digits if you really push it. That's how large Mecca would have likely been at the time of Muhammad and prior. That does not make sense if it's a major site of pilgrimage, because they tend to be more well attended. If you look at, for example, the Temple Mount, you do not just have a few hundred people living there, there's a lot of people living there. And the actual Hajj to these sites is huge. And it leaves a lot of archaeological evidence in the surrounding area, because things tend to be built to accommodate this. Whereas when we look at Mecca, we just don't really see that. You could have a halfway house, and I know Jay tends to push that Mecca is in no sense even a thing. It's just not an area. I think polemically, it's just safer to say Mecca was so insignificant it doesn't meet the descriptions of the traditions. Hence, the traditions are wrong, and hence Muhammad, the historical Muhammad, probably had very little to do with Mecca. But that's not the same as saying he didn't have anything to do with Mecca. He could have been born in Mecca and then just left because there's nothing going on there. There's nothing going on in a little tiny village in Mecca. It's not a town, it's not a city, it's definitely not a city. It is a village. It's a tiny little village. But anyway, I could go on forever talking about the problems with Mecca. But ultimately, given the fact that the Quran talks about significant religious figures, and even claims that the readers of the Quran, or the people who it's being recited to, are near things like the place where Sodom and Gomorrah happened, that doesn't make sense in the Meccan context at all. In the Arabian context, it doesn't make sense. Portray a deserter, that kind of region, it doesn't make sense. It needs to happen further north. Otherwise, you have to hold to what some scholars do hold to. I just find it really difficult to accept this. Maybe I could be corrected by people who are more knowledgeable than me. I'd love to hear it. But I don't think they had their own duplicate traditions of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Hijaz region. I think that's odd. Maybe there is reason to believe that, but to me it seems like whoever was giving this Quran recitation assumed that people actually knew this because they actually went there. And the Quran's quite clear. It says you walk past it frequently. And Muslims will try and say, well, it's because they're trading so much. And it's like, well, no, Mecca wasn't really very important for trade. No one really thinks this now, thanks to Patricia Crone and her work. It's just not, it's difficult, right? It's going to be really difficult. Either way, let's switch tact a little bit. Let's think about this. What can we say about Muhammad that might be a bit more interesting and a bit more closer to an actual person? He did, most likely, lead an army of Arabs up north. It seems to be the case. Now, who that person is a totally different question. That's a really, really difficult question in terms of identity. Who is that person? Is his name actually Muhammad? Is it something else? Is it the same person, or is this being redacted onto a different person? Because there are accounts of different people claiming to be prophets, all trying to conquer the Holy Lands, the Temple Mount in particular, to rebuild the third temple, which they technically did, if you think about it, from their perspective. And then nothing happened and they had to explain away what just happened. Muhammad was probably considered a prophet. This makes sense given that external sources who are not Muslim, they're people who observe the Muslims when they run at them with swords and axes. I don't know if they had axes at this point, but anyway, they would have had swords, I assume, or spears or whatever. They wrote down, the ones that survived, accounts of what they observed and what they saw, and they were under the impression that they were being led by a monotheistic prophet. That to me is sufficient historical evidence to say, yes, he was most likely a monotheistic prophet in terms of how the Saracens, the Ishmaelites, thought about him. But beyond that, it's going to get very difficult trying to explain who Muhammad is with any kind of degree of certainty. Is that a massive problem? No. No, it really, really isn't. For anybody, actually. Because in any historical event, you only have limited information to go with. You only have limited historical evidence, limited ways of going back in time, even just for things that are quite modern, like 100 years ago, 200 years ago. You may know the main stuff, right? You may know, for example, Muhammad was probably a monotheistic prophet in how people saw him. He probably led an army of Arabs to Syria. Okay, that's supported by some evidence there, and those are pretty big events. But things like, where was Muhammad on September 3rd, 623 AD? Like, you're probably not going to get an answer to that question. You're not going to be able to have the historical data to even begin to kind of answer that question. And similar things happen for Abraham Lincoln or John F. Kennedy. Unless that date happens to land on the same day a very well-documented, very significant event occurred, you're probably not going to be able to establish things historically. You can only rely on sources that may mention things that may have occurred on that day, maybe it was a different day, and there's less probability, and we have to be comfortable with that. Some things in the past, and this isn't just for Muhammad, it's for every historical person, you simply aren't going to have the complete data set to be able to say with confidence that certain things happened. And that's okay. That's acceptable. That's the nature of history. History is not some sort of scientific paradigm in which you can determine with some kind of repeated experiment that something was absolutely the case. It's not that. It's trying to, in a way, use a crystal ball along with some actual evidence through manuscripts, through epigraphy, coins, whatever it might be, to try and establish what most likely happened. That's all you can do, and that's the nature of looking into the past. And that leads me on to my next point. That also includes someone very beloved to us as Christians. That includes our Lord Jesus Christ. We are bound by the same limitations. Most historians who follow the historical critical approach would say we can know that there was a Jesus of Nazareth. He died and was crucified under Pontius Pilate. The disciples later on considered him to be resurrected and appeared to them, and they had shared experiences of a resurrected Jesus, who they believed then ascended. He was likely baptized by someone called John the Baptist, and so on. But if you want to talk about other aspects of Jesus's life, you're not going to be able to have the same kind of historical data to be able to back it up with the same level of probability as the other events I just mentioned. That is okay, because we don't have a time machine. We have a very fallible crystal ball and some pieces of evidence that we can try and piece together, but we don't have all the pieces to the jigsaw puzzle. We don't, and we likely never will. That's okay. One of the big things in life that I learned is you have to be okay with not having all the pieces to a puzzle, and you have to be okay with not being able to give the definitive answer, because life is not like that. Unfortunately, it's very few things in life that you can have that much control over and that much certainty over. Most things in life are just like your car. your car might not start tomorrow, but there's a good reason to think it will do. And you have to be happy with that. Unless you're a mechanic or you're some sort of car wizard that knows his car like the back of his hand, you have to be okay with just that level of probability, and that's okay. What I think this debate boils down to, and I'm going to kind of try and end with this now because I've probably been talking way too much, and future Chris is going to be annoyed with me that it has to do so much editing to trim this down. Sorry, future Chris. I think what's happening here is Jay in particular, because Jay is a leader and at the forefront of the revisionist perspective on Muhammad, because he's been so polemical and because he chooses to see this from the paradigm that when we say Muhammad, we mean the Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative, and therefore if that Muhammad isn't there, and we can show that with evidence, then there is no Muhammad. That's his view, and that's a valid view. And a lot of people, however, are in the other camp, whether they realize it or not, and they think, no. Just because the Muhammad of the standard Islamic narrative isn't true, there could still be a Muhammad in some sense. He just isn't the same as the Muhammad in the standard Islamic narrative. And because they're on that side, they worry that what Jay's arguing is leaning more towards a kind of mythicism, that there is no Muhammad in any sense, and therefore there's no way you can make meaningful historical statements about him, and therefore you should discard him as a person. And they're worried about that for a few reasons. The first is, that sounds very similar to something Christians have to deal with, which is the Jesus mythicist movement. There are many people who try to argue, still, even today, that there was no Jesus at all. He wasn't a historical figure at all in any sense. And when they hear Jay make those statements about Muhammad, they relate it to that, and they worry that Jay may be unknowingly presenting a case for a kind of religious figure denial, not just of Muhammad, but also of Jesus. And he may be inadvertently making the case for that without realizing he's doing it. That's one concern. The other concern is that, and this is more, I think, feel free to correct me, David, if you're watching, more in line of how David would and others would see this, which is that one of the best arguments to convince a Muslim to leave Islam is actually Muhammad's character. Because Muhammad did lots of different things regarding 9-year-olds, it's only one 9-year-old, don't worry, sex, slaves, burning people's eyes out and severing their limbs, these kind of things that you find in the hadith sources. They want to use this as a way of saying Muhammad is not a moral character, hence he cannot be a prophet, and hence Islam is false. It's a very straightforward argument, it's a very convincing argument. But if you undermine the historicity of Muhammad, you in a way kind of undermine this argument, because then it seems like you're saying one thing and then doing another. Because on the one hand you're saying Muhammad didn't exist, he wasn't even a real person. On the other hand you're saying, but really he really was a bad guy, and that somehow these don't seem to be in alignment, and they seem to give a more confusing perspective. It's also fair to say that this side, the group that is concerned about Jay Smith's perspective, that there is no historical Muhammad, and the way he presents it polemically, also have issues with things like the criteria of embarrassment. They believe that's a very strong principle, and they apply it also to the Christian faith to establish key facts about Jesus' life. But Jay would attack this because ultimately he has to attack the hadith, because the hadith cannot be describing the real Muhammad, because there are problems with it, and we know there are problems with it. I think the solution to this is quite simple. I think this is more of a matter of perception than anything else, and we need to be humble enough to realize other people have different perspectives on what it means to be Muhammad. What does it mean to be Muhammad? How do you become the Muhammad? And some people are going to say it has to be very strict, and some people are going to have a bit more loose understanding of what that means. Both are totally valid and true. I hate the word valid in this context, but it's the only way I can put it. It's a perfectly fine opinion to have either way. I do think, this is where I get a little critical of Jay, just a little bit. I think there has to be, and he actually presented this very well in the debate with Ibrahim. And again, I love both these guys. I do think technically Jay came out slightly better in this. And it's, in my opinion, just being honest with you, it's basically just because of this one point Jay made, which is that he said, look, we're talking about the main things that make Muhammad, and I'm saying those things from an Islamic paradigm aren't met in historicity, hence I can say there isn't a historical Muhammad. If you find some things that are historical, that's not enough to say that the Muhammad of the traditions is true. And I think because he made that clarification, he did better in that debate, because ultimately Ibrahim is not going to be able to say much about that, because in a way, just kind of being, this is just saying it how I think it is, I think he kind of agrees with that ultimately, and I think he kind of would have to. It's just that perhaps he would have issues with the kind of ways that Jay would go about presenting this. Jay presents it very assertively and polemically by saying things like, Muhammad did not exist, and of course that means different things to different people, and he thinks very highly of the criteria of embarrassment, and probably is concerned about allegations of mythicism, when I don't think that's really what Jay Smith is saying. I think it's just that Jay is very, he's not going to mince his words. He's going to go straight for the jugular, because he is a polemicist as well as an expert on this topic, and he is going to say, look, the Muhammad that you know and think didn't exist. But it's up to you to understand what you think that means. What does it mean for Muhammad to be a person? I take a lesser view, so I would say yes, there was a historical Muhammad. He's just not the historical Muhammad of the Standard Islamic narrative, and he probably varies quite substantially to the Standard Islamic narrative. I don't think that casts doubt with the hadith and the way that we can attack the hadith by simply talking about Muhammad's character vis-a-vis the Standard Islamic narrative. I think you could do both, and this is something I've found myself doing. Depending on who I'm talking to and what I want to stress, if I want to talk about the historical Muhammad, that's one hand, that's one, we're talking about this person as we know through history, and then we have the other hand, which is the Standard Islamic narrative, the Islamic traditions, and I can talk about that as well, and I don't see any problem with this. It just depends on what paradigm you're coming at this from. On the one hand, Standard Islamic narrative, Muhammad is a pretty bad guy. Probably shouldn't follow him. On the other hand, Muhammad that you think of him as did not exist, and therefore you shouldn't believe him. Both of these are totally fine. And one final point before I leave, let's have some grace with this, because when you deal with difficult questions where you have to ask, what do we mean by identity? What do we mean by Muhammad? At what point can we say this is with some confidence Muhammad as a person, as an identity? And at what point can we say with confidence, look, this is not the Muhammad of the Islamic traditions? There has to be some middle ground, and there has to be just grace for mistakes and errors and differences in terms of opinion. There's been some amazing work that's coming out by Christian apologists on this, and it's worth understanding that going to war over this question is kind of futile, given that, like I said at the beginning of this video, it's already decided. We already know the Islam of the Standard Islamic narrative is false. We don't need to keep going on about that. We already know it's false. So we're both on the same side. It's just a question of how do we want to talk about this? Ultimately, we all agree on this. So let's have grace with each other. People are coming at this from different angles. Let's be respectful and come together in a Christian manner. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this is a short video because I don't have that long to edit it, but let's see if this comes out today. I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you thought of the debate. Remind me to link the debate down below. If I don't, please leave a comment yelling at me to do so, because I am prone to forgetting. God bless you all, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.